Mann Beißt Hund has entered the debate for one of, if not the best German rap albums in recent time. And honestly, for me, one of the coolest things is that it's coming from a guy that a lot of us really haven't even heard of until recently. At worst, this album serves as a breath of fresh air for German rap, or frische Luft. And I honestly think it's way more than that. It's a success story because I, for years, thought that thanks to the rise of streaming platforms, we've really seen the infrastructure rewarding more so the artists that make these quick and more shallow songs, and basically making it so difficult for really talented artists to break through without following this quote-unquote zeitgeist, and in effect kind of suppressing the overall quality and just leaving fans kind of disappointed. That is until OG Keemo came along and said, "F you." Let me tell you why. So we're going to briefly touch on kind of the most important parts of the album and then go ahead and really dive deeper into the wider implications of the meaning, what it means to him, what it means to German rap as a whole, and the philosophical lessons that we could take, because quite honestly, that is the kind of stuff that I'm interested in. So what's important is that throughout the 17 tracks, OG Keemo tells a story from the perspective of three fictional characters, at least according to him in some of his interviews. Their names are Karim, Malik, and Yasha. And all three of them are really trying to find their place in a world from a very specific scenario, and that is with very little money, very little opportunity for social mobility. And what this is really a story about survival. We learn in the first track, Anfang, a little bit about their personalities. We find out early on that Malik is kind of, the older one, the role model of the group, and thinks very highly of his street experience and this tough guy reputation. He's fully committed to this gang-banger lifestyle. Karim, on the other hand, is a little more introverted, opposite of Malik. Has really just moved to this city. He's trying to find a friend group, and he's very naive, young, impressionable, and kind of willing to go with any group that welcomes him. But I think one of his most redeeming qualities, the one thing that got him into trouble and then later out of trouble, is in fact his curiosity. So following the events of Civic, which is the second track where the three friends under the leadership of Malik steal a Honda, Malik goes on to lecture Karim and Yasha on how the world works in Malik's opinion. And so this metaphor he uses is man and dog. And what this man and dog metaphor really serves as is a crude depiction of sociological issues and the relationship between the oppressed and the oppressors. And so further introspection kind of tells me that this metaphor isn't necessarily a blueprint as it's presented in the album, but more of a question whether you are in control of your own life or the life in which you live is in control of you. Further, this begs the question between the classical argument of free will and determinism. And this is represented in the Siedlung. It's fair to say that Malik's characterization of Siedlung throughout the album is more of an adherence to the philosophy of determinism. That is, there is no choice between man and dog, and how you were born is pretty much going to determine how your life will play out. Karim, however, in the story has other plans. So does Yasha. And now let's dive into what I describe as the question. For just a few tracks, it appears that, in my opinion, Karim and Yasha are kind of wrestling with the validity of Malik's argument. The tracks Malik and Big Boy follow Malik's day-to-day life, which includes violence, a reactive and relatively short-sighted mentality, and most importantly, the need to dominate his immediate environment at all costs. And so we can assume that Karim and Yasha are accompanying Malik in these adventures, so to speak, giving them a little bit more insight on how a dog's life may play out. The consequences of lying, stealing, and constantly running from the police kind of reach a breaking point in the minds of Yasha and Karim, and ultimately results in a test for their moral compass. And this is something that OG Keemo spoke about in an interview, which he detailed these fictional characters as almost a representation of his perspective and moral compass.
Ja, ich glaube einfach so, wenn du jung bist, ist dein moralischer Kompass irgendwie nicht so ganz das, was eigentlich sein sollte.
The sole purpose for the fictional characters that he has in this album, they're really his attempt to rationalize life on the streets, the harsh reality of it, and whether or not the bad things that, from the outside someone is doing on the streets really result in making that person bad. And so if their environment requires them to act badly to escape and be so-called a good person. We find out that this dilemma is essentially the core of the story. And now we really head to what I call the dilemma. The question that these guys have been asking, Keem and Yasha, in their minds and ultimately reaching an ultimatum. And so with the song Vertical, we can definitively say that this is a pivotal point in the album where Keem and Yasha are going to eventually have to make a choice between which lifestyle they actually want to live. The narrator in Vertigo, which many believe to be is Yasha, talks to us from atop a very tall building. And so his thoughts here on top of this building are just dominated by guilt and worries for kind of this criminal life that he's leading. He feels genuinely pretty bad about it. And it becomes really clear that he wants to be a good person, much like Keem, and he really wants nothing to do with the life that he's currently living and desperately wants out. And so almost as a continuation of the conversation that the three of them had in the stolen Civic prior, Yasha is elaborating on this idea and almost saying that there must be a life outside of the ruling class dominating the dogs, right? Where somebody can be free. And so he's really just grappling with this idea of how to achieve it. And so Yasha really wants to leave this environment. However, Yasha is really coming from a point of solitude and loneliness. On the other hand, Keem, as we learn in the track 2009, wants to get out just like Yasha, but has other motivation. That is, he's noticing that there is something in life that it's more powerful than money, hoes, and respect. You know, all of these things that Malik is chasing and kind of preaching to these younger guys. That is, you know, kind of what makes a dog. And that is, of course, love and family, something Keem alludes to, and as we know, doesn't really exist freely in the Siedlung. And so at this point, I kind of want to step back and highlight what is going on. It's kind of the undercurrent of the psychological implications to the three men, what they're dealing with, and how each of them are rationalizing their experiences in different ways. And so these three men have been thrown into this type of community that really lacks some of the key things that a lot of us take for granted in a society that gives us the chance to lead a meaningful life. So these fundamental building blocks for leading a meaningful life is described by one of the most renowned psychologists, Abraham Maslow, in his hierarchy of needs. Physiological needs, which refers to homeostasis, food, water, shelter, and temperature. And that means that you are at least comfortable and you have a good idea of where you're going to go to bed and where your next meal is coming from. And then there's security, or at least the illusion of it. Social needs, esteem, the need for respect and appreciation. And lastly, self-actualization. Basically, this is personal growth or the willingness to achieve one's potential. And so Maslow points out that without the first four, and they must be achieved in that order chronologically, self-actualization or actual fulfillment and meaning ceases to exist in life itself. It's really important to note that this is widely accepted by many psychologists, but of course is a theory and isn't necessarily fact. However, since it follows some pretty understandable logic, it's going to be my rationale for this story. And so with these three young men seemingly missing life's crucial building blocks, with time, their suffering is eventually going to demand action. Interestingly enough, each character deals with the problem in radically different ways, highlighting the options one individual may have available to them in this certain situation that OG Keemo apparently was a victim of. And now in the later portions of the album, we move on to what I call is the solution, kind of the culmination of what this problem has become in the respective characters' minds and how they each radically deal with it. As I just mentioned, each character has really reached a crossroads with each other. But it's worth mentioning that up until now, the time that they've spent together has been nothing short of cherished times together, a true brotherhood. But now they must make a choice on how they want to fit into the world, and will eventually come to realize that they all see the world in radically different ways, resulting in a very painful divergence from one another. And so these decisions really play out in their own separate songs. First, Petrichor, Keem decides to eventually get up and leave the Siedlung for a better life. Opposite, Regen and Sandman, Malik decides to stay in the block, as he believes he really belongs there. And lastly, really one of the most emotional songs is Vogel, and this is where Yasha decides to eventually jump from this building that was described in Vertigo. And unfortunately, he saw this as the only realistic opportunity to leave the block. You know, after the later tracks detail the decisions that each character makes, we come to, again, what I call the aftermath. And so as the story ultimately comes to a really bittersweet end, something begins to become apparent, and that is the characters Malik, Kareem, and Yasha are actually a fictional depiction of OG Keemo's morality, and that the thoughts of each character actually represent the thoughts of himself. And this inner struggle to really come to grips with this unfair life that was kind of thrusted onto him, and realistically the decisions he had to make to solve this problem. And so if we take a look at Malik's character, a persona that Keemo uses to describe his initial outlook on his situation and the suppression of the poor by the ruling class. Malik, who may not like his lifestyle or situation, sees it as his destiny, which closes off any possibility for taking control of one's own life. It's very easy for people to blame their life's problems on the other, the rich, the powerful, and with time may seek comfort in the illusion of the lack of choice. Not because it's what's best, but because it's easiest. And this really becomes apparent in the songs told from Malik's perspective, when he insists on repeating his dangerous nature, how he owns the streets, and how he has so much money and hoes. He's so adamant on clinging to hollow pursuits that at best yield him the temporary pleasure and approval from fellow dogs who don't even love or care for him in the first place, since their own insecure and selfish ways have them worrying about the same things, resulting in a broken, empty, depressing society. On the other hand, Kareem sees leaving the block as a viable solution. Kareem represents the tendencies to be brave, bold, and principled in nature, as he knows leaving the block alive is unheard of in his small crew and unknown, and therefore scary. Fear, after all, is just dread for the unknown. And I really think a final comparison of this album to Plato's allegory of the cave, in which was a really pivotal piece in one of his more renowned works, The Republic. In it, Plato's mentor, Socrates, describes a group of people who have lived chained to the wall of a cave all their lives, facing a blank wall. The people watch shadows projected on the wall from objects passing in front of a fire behind them, and give names to these shadows. The shadows are the prisoner's reality, but are not accurate representations of the real world. The shadows represent the fragment of reality that we normally perceive through our senses, while the objects under the sun represent the true forms of objects that we can only perceive through reason. So what does this mean? Siedlung, very similar to Plato's cave here, suppresses upward social mobility. Later in this allegory, Socrates explains that a philosopher, or really someone who constantly questions their own reality, its possibilities, and is, how he describes it, one of the prisoners who was freed from the cave. Eventually, as you can guess, the prisoner comes to realize that the shadows that he was seeing in the cave were not indeed actual reality at all, rather an illusion. And so he returns to the cave to free the other prisoners, only to realize that they have no desire to leave at all, for they cannot even imagine life beyond the cave. Obviously, you can begin to see some parallels here, and that is when the mind is conditioned in the rigid way to adhere to strict social boundaries and limiting experiences such as education and opportunities for productivity, the foundation of an ideal society begins to crumble. Unfortunately, Malik doesn't see it this way and forces the two to eventually split, arguably representing the emotional anxiety Keemo really had to go through in making a choice, not knowing whether or not his outcome would get him what he wanted. But thanks to love and the prospect of a family, he gave himself no other options. Yasha, in Vogel, as we learn, also sees an alternative to Malik's metaphor, dog versus man. But unfortunately, this doesn't include escaping alive, but rather embodying a different animal altogether, a bird. This character arc represents, according to OG Keemo in an interview, a sad conclusion many come to in the block, one almost OG Keemo came to, and that is taking one's own life as a better solution to living and fighting, which is obviously not what Keemo decided to go through with, but instead lived and escaped to tell us one of the most unique and profound stories that this medium has seen in a very long time. And I really do think that this is the reason, above all, why OG Keemo's Mann Beißt Hund is what I would characterize as a once in a 10-year album event. It takes a very raw, visceral, and honest approach to a problem that many undeserving people in this world have to go through. A problem that has been at the core of hip-hop since its very origins. And not just that, coming along in a time where authenticity of struggle and morality has been missing for quite some time now. And he does this in a way by detailing his own struggles and shows us that yes, the path will be uncertain. It will be brutal and it will be painful, but there's always a way out so long as hope and love dominate your thoughts, regardless of your situation. If you guys like this video and the format that I follow, please check out this video as it's very similar. However, I'm taking a look at Alligators Nachbeben. I really think you guys will enjoy that one. I thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one.